Okay, so I have a quote to frame our conversation, and I'm sure it's something that you've heard before because it's kind of everywhere. And it
Okay.
and it goes, "The longest journey you will ever take is the 18 inches from your head to your heart."
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Yeah, you'll see it pop up. It just comes up in,
Yeah.
places here and there, and it's often attributed to different people. I see it most often attributed to Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a
Uh-huh.
Buddhist monk and died a couple years ago and has a bunch of books, and he's kind of like the grandfather of mindfulness and compassion. And I just love it because I think that is what I think of when I think of your journey.
Yeah.
And the spirit of the show, I'll meet you there. It implies a journey, either that someone is on a journey, because we all are, but also that someone's taken a journey that's meaningful, that kind of has led to some sort of alignment and some sort of truth around living what matters most. So I'm starting there to frame this conversation for our listeners because you, of all people, I mean, I've met a lot of people in my life, in my work world, in my personal world, but when I think of your journey and when I think of you moving from an idea of frame of mind, the way you are living,
Mhm.
through the last, I don't know, I think I've known you for 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So through that period of time to being one of the most heart-centered people, not that you weren't before, but just a full embodiment of what matters most to you. So that's where I'm oriented. That's where I'm pointing our listeners. That's where I want you to help us go there and take us there. So let's start with before all the wiser in this particular meaningful project that I think is a big focus of our conversation today, just kind of where you were in your life and what was happening and what inspired you to get really interested in that journey.
Well, I have to start by credit where credit is due, Paige. We all meet guides in our life, right? Certainly, I met 100 and on
Yeah.
the podcast that you and I birthed over a cup of coffee to some extent.
Yep.
Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing that beautiful quote I've never heard, but you really were or have been and continue to be such a important influence and mentor and friend and guide in my life. So,
Mhm.
thank you for that, but to answer your question, 10 years ago when we met, I mean, it's kind of crazy
Yeah.
to even wrap my head around it based on where I sit today, which I guess part of is just getting older and wiser. But I was thinking about this very question about when we met. So I think 10 years ago, we met right before I had my youngest, Esty. And so I had a 5-year old and a 3-year old. I was building a house. I was partnered a short form content company where
Yeah.
almost all of our filming was on the East Coast. My side hustle was a book that was about to be published, and the publishing date was like, 6 weeks after I gave birth. And that was how I rolled.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you I was also volunteering at the school, throwing the
Absolutely.
holiday party, going on
Yes.
the trips, and I just functioned that way. And there was, a lot of good that came from all of those things. One of the lessons I learned, and Edith Eger, who you and I talk all about, that I don't know how old she is now, 95, probably a Holocaust
90s. Oh,
survivor,
yeah.
90
Yeah.
something, yeah. She says, "How do you spell love?" And it's Time, time. And, well, I thought, "Well, I'm doing all the things, and I'm showing up, and I'm volunteering at the school,
Yeah.
and I'm throwing the event, and I'm pursuing a career that I'm passionate about and I believe in," but it didn't leave a lot of time for the things that matter most.
Yeah.
And it didn't leave a lot of time to be present and enjoy all the goodness and all of those different things. And I think I just kind of was trying to do it all and be it all, and there was a sense of, I think, kinda emptiness
Yes.
and restlessness and maybe even sadness, and then that felt conflicted because I'm like, "Well, wait, I have all the things. I'm doing all the right things,
Yeah.
right?"
Yeah.
And, almost like a shame of, well, why inside do I feel sorta empty and restless and
Yes.
and periods of, I think, sadness.
Yeah.
And
And I wanna offer a word too for listeners who can resonate with that. It's a longing. I think there's a sense of longing for something and we don't know what it is, especially when you have so much of the big core fundamental things. You're happily
yes.
married, you had a beautiful house where you were hosting your neighbors and friends, and you have healthy children and you have meaningful work. It's not like you didn't like your work. You were doing things that kind of fit with your skill set. It's just the pace of life and that question of, is there something else for me that's a deeper truth?
That is beautifully put because, yes, that is the right descriptive sort of versus feeling sad. It was, I think, a longing, right, for
Yeah.
something more connected and meaningful. And yeah, so I mean, just where I am today, and that, only took me a decade.
It was less than that. I was trying to think of when we first started working together,
Yeah.
but that's why the quote is so beautiful because it's a journey that we
Mhm.
never stop taking. I
Yeah.
just think what interests me about your story and what was so inspiring for me to witness is how you did it consciously. And that's the
Yeah.
people who are listening are trying to do that consciously, and I know so many wonderful, amazing people, clients and friends who are also doing it consciously, and that takes courage. I remember sitting down with you, and it wasn't like the podcast was the first idea. It was like
Yeah.
layers of how can I change my life? What are little things that I can do to bring me more in touch with what is truly important to me?
Wait, what do you mean by doing it consciously?
I think with awareness, like I think some people
Like, I
it's
didn't stumble into it? Is that what you mean?
yes, you didn't
Yeah.
stumble into it. You went on a intentional quest to know more about yourself, to
Yeah.
ask hard questions. You
Mhm.
got in a relationship with me as a coach first before we
Yeah.
knew each other socially. And you sought all sorts of guidance, not just through our relationship, but reading and talking to other women
I
who had come
love an
before you.
expert. I love
Yeah, you really do.
We've worked on that too. You're like,
Yeah.
"Maybe just trust your intuition."
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But, yeah, so I mean an awareness, an
Yeah.
intentionality. I think
Yeah.
that was very much how you went about that journey, and I think for the purposes of, like, getting into All the Wiser, you did have a sort of calling to offer something, some sort of
Yeah, that's true.
contribution. Yeah,
Mhm.
so tell us about when you started to pull back on the speed of your life
Yeah.
and what that looked like to move into something that was a little bit more creative and your own pace.
Well, I had produced a documentary film that was a big, kind of ambitious nonfiction film, and that project ended. I was like, "I'm gonna take 6 months and sort of take some time to not work," which felt so foreign to me, right? Like, always
Yeah,
had a project, always had a thing. So I started falling in love with podcasts, which I
yeah.
really hadn't listened to, and I was fine kind of creating the space, not working, and then one day I just started crying at Old Navy. It was like 11 o'clock on a Tuesday,
Yeah, I've
and
been
I'm like,
there. Yeah.
"What am I doing?" Like, just kinda wandering around, and I'm like, I don't know how to explain it, but it was this moment where I don't even remember, but it was like this moment where like I want to do something, but I didn't want to do it the way I had done it before. And the way I had done it before was what I just touched upon. It was like a lot of hustle and grinding and a million balls in the air. And that no longer felt good to me. And I wanted to
Yes,
move away from that. I also, Paige, didn't even believe that I was capable of that.
yes,
I remember telling you, like, that's just
for
how I
sure.
am. That's just how I'm wired. I want to be more present, but that's just not, I truly didn't think I was a person who could not work, who could do less. I just thought I'm too restless. It's not even possible for me
Yes.
not to get this energy out. But I fell in love with podcasting and I landed on this idea that I had spent my entire career in nonfiction storytelling and journalism. And my background, I had worked in big network and big media for Good Morning America and Oprah. And my strong suit was to kind of sort of go into these situations, but I never had control. But I would go into a situation, have a really intimate, real, honest conversation,
Yeah.
ask questions with somebody looking at me who trusted me, right?
Yes.
Who trusted me with their story. And the way it works in network television, or if you're working for, ABC or NBC or Oprah or all these places I worked, is you then take the footage and hand it off.
Yes.
And then it's sliced and diced, and there's some music splashed on it, and I wasn't a, quote unquote reporter on air or anchor.
Yeah.
So the spirit of the conversation, it never felt honored to me. Not only did it not feel true, but like I so often felt the best of it was lost.
Yes.
And there was so much wisdom and heart and depth. And I was really interested in having those conversations and like in their entirety and letting them breathe and learning from them. And I understood that high stakes stories, there was a reason and is a reason where Hollywood and, true crime, all of these things, people are drawn to stories where the
Yeah.
stakes are really high. But I was really interested in like the personal aspect of how people are changed and how they come out the other end of something and how their relationships change, how their spirituality changes. And I wanted to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I remember having that conversation with you around kind of the clickbait nature of media, and it's gotten
Yeah.
even so much worse now with Instagram because when you were in it, it was still you're on the television side. It wasn't like you were doing little bits and reels for Instagram yet.
Yeah.
And even when we first met, Instagram isn't what it is today.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
it's all of that, I think, really stuck with you around the negative energy. And my experience of you talking about that time of your life was it was starting to catch up with you. It was
Yeah.
you were like holding on to the stress and you were looking for an outlet where you could still storytell, you could still use your experience, your professional experience that you had from journalism, but it was a much more complete, more authentic, like, positive experience for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree.
And then podcasting, I mean, you and I talked about it kinda casually, but you've actually had some early seeds planted with podcasting.
Oh, my
With
grandfather?
yes, like, I didn't know that. Actually, we didn't even really talk about that until you were creating a website, and you were like, "Actually, this is a cool part of the story." So will you tell our listeners about kind of your relationship with
Yes.
those
So,
early
okay.
years?
So, my grandpa Tom was the voice of Cleveland. So, what
Yeah.
he was a radio host and he would read the news and play music, and he was a disc jockey, well, a storyteller, really.
Yeah.
And, would play music and tell stories and talk about the news of the day in Cleveland. And I would go into the radio station and sit on his lap.
Yeah.
And, he had I'll tell you the story about the microphone in a second, and he would just chain smoke
Yes.
the entire
I
time.
love it.
He had, like, a microphone, he had, like, a four-year-old and, one arm, like, a cigarette in the other
Yeah,
hand, and he was just talking, and so, I mean, hard to say what influence that played, but you have to believe something.
for sure. Seeds
Um,
were planted.
yeah, and then the night I think you know this story.
Yeah.
The night I decided to do a party at our house and launch the podcast
Yes.
and kinda to friends and family to let people know I was doing it and hopefully people would tune in. So we threw this big party and I had one of our first guests tell a live story on stage, and Katie Browning, who introduced us, one of my best friends in the world, walks in and my mom found my grandfather's old microphone, like, in an attic and sent it to Katie, who and sh they put it in the middle of flowers, like a
Yeah.
beautiful bouquet of flowers, and handed it to me, which I'll never forget. So,
So beautiful.
yeah, so it's cool.
So when you first start doing the podcast, tell me what it was like to be on the microphone. Like, what was that journey for you? What were some of the barriers? What were some of the early obstacles of, can I do this? Is this working? I mean, it started very organically. You kind of honed in on the idea of the type of person you wanted to interview based on what you shared with us a few minutes ago. It's like you've always been drawn to those emotional moments with people, deeply connecting and finding the truth in a
Yeah.
situation.
Mhm.
So, actually, before the obstacles or barriers, help us understand, like, all the wiser, like, coming to that, what did you envision it being about? And then what was it really about once you got in there and really started meeting these people and these guests?
I think if I go back, I knew, and it may have even been from a question you asked me, in all my years of interviewing people, who did I remember and who stuck with me?
Yeah.
And when I started to think about that and see the connect the dots,
Yes.
it was people who had faced incredible adversity and had been able to get through it and sort of synthesize, articulate how they had been changed, their wisdom. Like those were the stories that really, really stuck with me. And I, done hundreds, if not maybe even thousands of stories, because a lot of it when you're doing, morning shows, it's every day you're doing a new story.
Yeah.
And the ones that stuck out to me had those common
Yes.
factors. And so the idea was to at first it was to find 50
Yes. Oh, I
people,
remember this. Yeah.
and we had a charitable component. I really wanted to do something that had, like, an intersection of cause and story,
Yeah.
because I just believed in that and thought it was an interesting and fresh way to, not only support nonprofits financially, but use storytelling as an asset, right? So
Yeah.
it's one thing to hear about, oh, this charity does great work. It's another thing to really immerse yourself and go deep in
Yeah.
somebody's experience, like whatever it is with addiction or with mental health or with cancer, and truly understand the heart of it. And then you hear, about the people who are on the front lines of that very
Yes.
thing. So we got excited about that. I knew that the stories, I was interested in telling these high stakes dramatic stories, but doing it in a way that was really had a lot of heart and soul. And frankly, I mean, one of the things that was really confusing about it, and I think would go under the category of obstacles, is a lot of people, you and I not being two of them, don't wanna go towards stories of weight,
Yeah.
and they're heavy subject matter, and I think most of the time we got there, but I wanted there to be, like, a sense of lightness and room for people to
Yes.
breathe and laugh and all of those things.
Yeah.
So, that was the idea, and you and I came up with the name, and it just sort of started to, yeah,
Yeah.
to go.
And I remember coming up with the name with you. I remember that particular session because I think that idea of why does it matter? For you, exploring these stories, yes, you have the temperament to do that. You can stay very calm under pressure. You have the journalism background. You know how to guide a person through a story. You know how to extract like the moment,
Mhm.
the critical moments from the story. But I always felt like the inspiration for you is on the other side of that hardship is
Yeah.
a lesson, and the
Yeah.
service part was so important to you. So I'm bringing that to light for people who are listening because I think a lot of our listeners are curious about a creative project, and it doesn't have to be in this professional way, like you're launching a
Mhm.
film or
Yeah.
podcast. It could be that you're redoing your house. It could be that you're spending more time with an aging parent because you recognize the finite nature of their life. Or you could be sinking into some cause or a nonprofit just for your own sense of contribution. There's so many different ways that we kind of devote ourselves to something, but I think for me, that process of digging into that question with you was so inspiring because when you ask, okay, why does it matter? Okay, why does it
Mhm.
matter? And
Yeah.
keep digging into that, you arrive. And I felt like you arrived to the word of wisdom, which is why we got to all the wiser. Because for you, it was about what is all this hardship for? This can't be for nothing. This
Yeah.
has to be for something. And that's the thing that you can share and that helps other people, which for you is it's always about connection.
Yeah. And I think as far as, like, starting a new project, if people listening, even though my background was in interviewing and storytelling, this was, like, very much beginner's mind. I had no
Yeah,
idea anything about audio equipment because you work in television, there's somebody who understands sound, who understands lighting, everything. Like, you sit down. So all this
I get
I'm,
it.
like, in a closet,
Yeah,
this an 18-year-old kid, I bought all of this, like, gear on random websites, and he's trying to teach me. I'm not even great with the television remote, even though I used to work in it was a little bit, like, hot messy, just figuring it all
yeah,
out, and I had never had my voice on camera. I was
yeah,
always behind the scenes, so I had never been up front. I mean, I'd certainly as a producer, you're promoting what you're doing, but as far as like my voice or my sharing my personal story, that had never been in the cards.
right.
So that I mean, at first I used to like go through the transcript and like by year 5, I'm like,
Yeah.
F it.
By year 2.
That's true. That's true.
I'm not
Early
there
on.
yet. I'm still a little bit like, "What did I sound like?" But I'm way better than I was when I started, and I haven't even done it a year yet. It's a quick I mean, you gotta let go of stuff, but I understand that hurdle. I mean, that's a great example of an
Even hearing
obstacle.
your voice, like,
Yes.
yes.
And it can be any form of creative expression. When I
Yes.
think of all the people with whom I've spoken on this podcast in the last year, everybody has some form of risk that they took when they put their creative expression out
Yeah.
for somebody else to judge, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you get the title, you're up against your ego, you're up against perfectionism and insecurity and
Mhm.
all self doubt, all these things.
Yeah.
What helps you? What is the thing that you sink into as you get better at your job or as you start to really love this project? Take us through like when did you find that flow? Like, oh, I can get over myself and really love this. Was that through a particular guest? Was that through just familiarity with the process, just discipline, consistency?
Consistency. I mean,
Mhm.
doing it at 3 months versus 5 years in was a very different experience,
Yeah.
and I made a lot of mistakes, including, as you know, Paige and I may or may not have an intellectual crush on someone named BJ Miller, who you should Google,
And
and
listen to his TED Talk.
listen to his TED Talk. He's also happens to be really cute, and flew to San Francisco to his house to do the interview in person and forgot to hit record, and it was like a
Yeah.
2-hour conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, there was, like, dramatic pauses, and then for
Gosh.
6
Yes.
months, beat myself up. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I thought, "How could you?" Just, "You're not
Yeah.
cut out for this. That's why you work with other people with budgets and who know what they're doing. And I can't email him again. He's a big deal. My podcast is small. You've got to go through his people. And then I think at some point I emailed them and they emailed back like 20 minutes later. I just said I made a mistake and I don't have the audio. And they said, "Great, BJ's available next week. We'll do it on Zoom." So,
Yeah.
I mean, that was year one. And I think I just grew more comfortable, more at ease, more myself,
Yeah.
more confident. You and I talk a lot about spirituality and God. And at some point, it 100% felt like a spiritual
Yes.
project to me. And the only way I would articulate that, or not the only way, but I maybe it's hard to explain, right? When something feels so personal and spiritual,
Yeah.
is that I kind of let go and thought, like, let me ask the question that this person wants to answer. Like, so often I talk to people who had been through horrible things, who had lost a child, and just simply asking them to tell me about their child, to bring them to
Yeah.
life. So instead of like gripping, all the questions are spot on and the recording is perfect and I'm coming across as articulate and knowledgeable
Yeah.
and knowing that my job was to show up and be deeply present and deeply prepared and that
Yeah.
the rest would happen because I trusted that myself and the guests were there for a reason that would be of a higher service to somebody listening.
Yeah.
And once I started getting into that mindset, I think the work became a lot less stressful because I was doing it with more ease, if that makes sense.
For sure.
Yeah.
I love what you said about that because you mentioned the beginner's mind earlier.
Mhm.
And that with what you just shared, it feels like the beginner's mind has an open heart.
Yeah.
When your heart is open, you can get over any sense of doubt that I don't know enough, or
Yeah.
I'm not enough, or I don't have the right experience. Because at the end of the day, when you're present and connected to the intention of what you're doing, which is
Mhm.
something that you started doing, you even mentioned it. I remember you switching to really getting clear about setting an intention
Yeah.
before the conversation, which I
Yeah.
always share this with people. Like, even if it's going into a party, even if it's going into like a school event where you're like, this is no big deal. I have to go to parents' night or I have to go to this staff meeting on Monday morning for my job. But when you bring an intention to it, it immediately gets your heart in it in a different
Yeah.
way. And it invites what you describe as relaxing, letting go, knowing what it's really all about. Like what it's
Yeah.
all about is love and faith and hope. And, it's about the big virtues.
Well, you very much taught me this, and before All the Wiser and before doing the podcast, I did a fair amount of public speaking and some throughout, for sure, at least like 1 or 2 things a year,
Yeah.
and you helped me with a lot of those talks or speeches. and you have to prepare, right?
You have
It's
to.
yeah,
Yes.
people
Yes.
have trusted you
Yeah.
to tell a compelling story, to
Yeah.
convey a message or to entertain whatever, their objective. But I wanted it to be perfect, and I wanted to find the
Yeah.
perfect word and the image and the arc, and I just remember you saying, like, "People just want real."
Yeah.
That's another way of explaining, like, the growth in the podcast, that I think at first I probably wanted something more perfect and polished, and as time went on, I got really comfortable in having it just be real,
Yeah.
which oddly, not not oddly, is more compelling content.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy how it works like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so interesting that you pick the most imperfect guests. I mean, your
Yeah,
guests had these incredible, I love that word that you used in the All the Wiser intro, unthinkable.
yeah.
Truly unthinkable things happen where you can't imagine. And so tell us about what it's like to sit down. What do you learn from these people you never would have sat down with? You never would have crossed paths with so many of your guests. Some of them you would have, but some of them, they're just not in your orbit. And you sit down with them and you found that very human connection that kind of
Yeah.
transcended any story, race, class, ethnicity, difference in life history. Tell us about what that felt like.
To your point, I sat down with people who had been incarcerated, who had
Yeah.
been living in prison for, 20 years and who had been out 6 months because as young boys were in gang life or drunk
Yeah.
driving accident, and their stories were beautiful and they
So
were,
beautiful.
oh,
Yes.
incredible,
Yeah.
and talk about like an arc, right? Where they
Yeah.
started versus where they are today, which was, and those accounts, like, out being men of service and these just
Yeah.
incredible lives, and so, yeah, I wouldn't in my, like, suburban LA mom life,
Yeah.
those aren't the people that I would, by chance spend 3 hours talking about life with. I mean, the youngest person we talked to on the podcast was, like, a first grader.
Yeah.
During COVID, we did, and, up to 95 and, you name it, race, gender, religion, and most people, you find connections,
Yeah.
no matter how different your lives are, and you certainly, if you're, paying attention, can learn something, and yeah, it was really cool and deeply meaningful to be connected, to have the opportunity to meet that diversity of and not just meet, but really
Yeah.
get to hear their story and have them trust me with sharing it.
Yeah. And I think this notion of really listening,
Mhm.
I feel like that's something that's missing in our culture. It's very fast. We're on the go. We're looking at our phone. We're checking messages. We're checking news cycles. This is what I found from doing a podcast. And even if you're not doing a podcast, just being present in a conversation, to actually sit down and give someone your full attention, your whole attention, and the value that that person feels
Yes.
in sharing the story, that was so moving. You would do these interviews with people who were, like you said, like on the brink of something very new or very difficult. They had a lot of trauma in their life,
Mhm.
and I think by you opening your heart and fully paying attention to them, the process itself was so healing,
Yeah.
regardless if you ever published it as a podcast or not. Just that it's healing for you, knowing that your perfect story, which isn't
Mhm.
perfect, but,
Yes.
you letting more in of the total story of your life
Yeah.
and feeling more honest about that through them sharing theirs. It's just this beautiful exchange that I think we could all be inspired by, and we could probably all do a better job of it, just in our day-to-day life.
As you know, it started off very much as a professional project and, became deeply personal on so many levels.
Yeah.
One was sharing my own story of having bipolar disorder and hiding it for most of my life. And then my dad, at 82 has bipolar disorder as well, genetic,
Yeah.
and was diagnosed at 50, hid it from everyone, and at 82 comes on, has a conversation with me, and tells, you know, 20,000 people
Yeah.
that he has this illness and what he's learned from it. My sister-in-law had a accident with my nephew when he was born in the hospital and had a tremendous amount of shame and OCD. She came on and told her story,
Yeah.
and I know they both would say how liberating and
Yeah.
freeing and healing. And, it's so true, and it's certainly been true for me that my own story going into the podcast, sharing my story, I have, like, almost no attachment to it anymore.
Yes.
Like, it is so not a big deal to me. I don't know that I would even be interested if somebody said, "Can you know, write about it or come talk about it anymore?" But I talk about it all the time. I talked last night to a mom whose daughter is in college
Yeah.
and was diagnosed. So, like, at least 5, 6 times a year, I get a call,
Yeah.
almost always from a mom of a college student.
Yes.
Um
Which is kind of tracks for your experience because so
Yeah,
much
but
you
my
didn't
point
know.
yeah, but my point being that just talking about the hard things
Yeah.
and being honest about it and putting it out there, and then I think in my case, it's allowed me to not or has, like, to not be stuck in it, to not be ashamed of it, but now, like, just to be a resource for people,
Yeah.
like, it's really incredible, so thank you for saying that you think the everybody who came on the show that it was helpful and healing to them, but it certainly was to me
Yeah.
as well. It was an exchange, that process for sure.
Yeah. And the truth sets you free. That's
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
exactly whether it's a guest
Mhm,
or your own.
mhm.
What did you find from the vulnerability just in your personal community of putting out this creative project, your own story, as you just mentioned, being out in just your immediate world? Because I talk to a lot of people who are actually very worried about just their immediate world judging them, not even like the public, but just what is my really good friend going to think about this? And what is this
Oh,
woman in the carpool line going to think? Tell us about how your listeners came forward and what you heard from people.
you know how moms always say, and I say this to my girls too, like, "Not everyone's thinking about you." You know what I mean? Like, we're always
Yeah.
like, "Oh my god, they're thinking they said" like,
Yeah.
that was definitely how I felt. I'm like, people are gonna be like, "Oh, she's too much," or da da da, or, I don't know what they were gonna say, but I was for sure being really vulnerable and being really honest about my life and my
Yeah.
inner world and my thoughts, and it felt very vulnerable. Like,
Yeah.
I did feel like people are probably, I don't know, making fun of it or just even commentary, "Oh, I don't like the podcast," or "She says too much." I don't know. I just felt like
Yeah.
I had opened myself to
Yes.
critique, criticism,
Yeah.
depending on the
All
day,
of
how you
it.
would think
Yeah.
about, and I would actually never know what was being said or if anything was being said.
Yeah.
And probably at the beginning, going back to editing myself more and caring more. And then towards the end, I was just kind of like, it doesn't really matter if people in my social world here in LA have an opinion about it that's negative or critical, because I knew that I had built a community and I knew that the stories were making a difference. And,
Yeah.
whether that was my dad or, somebody who is in the throes of cancer and, heard an interview that made them feel less alone, like
Yeah.
that if the cost was me being nervous or insecure that people may be talking about me because I was putting so much out there,
Yeah.
that I was okay with that. The good was worth it, and I just had to let go of that, but that wasn't easy at all at first,
No.
but I would
No.
say that by the end, I was like, "F it."
Which is where we all go
Yeah.
eventually. Especially when you're taking in the good. I think that's another thing to celebrate the small wins along the
Yeah.
way. Sometimes when we start these new projects, again, whether it's professional or personal, it's like it's got to be so big, it has to be so significant, and then it has to lead to this other thing. Like you and I talked about that in the beginning. Well, maybe the podcast is going to be the beginning of a media platform or different versions of that. And who knows what you'll do in your life. You're young and you're full of great ideas. But I think also there's the value of being with the good at whatever
Yeah.
stage you're in,
Yeah.
letting it just be the size that it is, and
Yeah.
it unfolds and it stays close to what you really want to get from it, like the joy of it. And I think
Well, the
that's
funny
was
thing,
so you.
Paige,
Yeah.
is and, we built an incredible community, and certainly the
Yeah.
podcast was successful, and, we had some really nice recognition. For sure, the project had meaning and impact. But working with you, it's so funny now to think about it.
Yeah.
I wanted to break through, to have a
Yeah.
podcast that a million people, to have it be a breakthrough project
Yes.
that,
Yes.
a media thing that turned into a thing. And thank God.
I know. I know.
It's where I am
Yeah.
now and my total clarity of what matters most, which at this point, with my kids getting older, is me being present and available to them.
Yeah.
And my past of being really ambitious and
Yeah.
putting like that the podcast was exactly the size it was meant to be.
Yeah.
And, because I think had it been like this uber successful thing, there would have been a lot of pressure
For
to
sure.
keep it going. And I feel like it was impactful, but also allowed me to end at 5 years. And yeah, I'm just so much more readily available for the small moments in my life. And that is exactly, you know, how I want to think about my time.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting you interview people about the biggest moments of their life,
Yes.
and you end up being attuned to the smallest ones in yours?
Yes.
And maybe they do too. Maybe that was the arc. What did you find a lot of the arc of your guests? Was it a spiritual arc? Was it a perspective arc? Can
Yeah.
you
Mhm.
point to any kind of theme that would the guests that really stuck with you? And do you think about any of them? Sometimes I think about some of them will pop in my head. I don't know
Which
all their
one?
names. The woman who was a hostage and
Yes.
she had to go through the alphabet, or she had to use that discipline to, like, be exactly where she was and
Jessica
re
Buchanan,
yes.
she was kidnapped in Somalia. She was in a
Yeah.
desert, I think, for, like, almost 3 months, yeah.
I think about when I'm going through something I don't have a high threshold for pain,
Yeah,
like physical
yeah,
pain, and so to think about people who can really control their mind,
mhm,
if I'm physically uncomfortable, I think about that one, and I think about the shark attack, the
yeah,
father and the son,
mhm. Their
and
conversation on the paddle
yes.
boards, you talk about what matters most, and
Yeah.
I think for anybody who goes through something that catastrophic or traumatic or unthinkable, everything comes into focus really quickly about what
Yeah.
matters most. So there was a huge through line about family, about love, about how we show up for one another. Almost always there was, for lack of a better word, a character who was the hero in the story, whether it was like a nurse who said one thing, like
Yes.
my sister in law, or a pastor, in a prison. There was
Yeah.
always somebody. So I think that, like, the impact that you can have on someone's life and, this idea of how much is out of our control, but what we can control,
Yes.
really, right?
Yeah.
Is, as we know, the stories we tell ourselves, our mindset. So I think there was a lot of themes about, family, about what matters
Yeah.
most, about mindset, about um,
Relationship. I felt like a lot of
relationships.
people really figured out the quality of their relationship and
Mhm.
were became honest and gratitude. I mean, that was another reason why
Huge,
I think
huge.
for you've always been a grateful person, and I feel like I've been a grateful person too, but to really embody gratitude is that journey from the head to the heart, and I think gratitude is one of those virtues that is a heart opener. The
Yeah.
more you practice it, the more available you get to feel it, and you move through the world with a more open heart when you're committed to that perspective and, like, orientation of gratitude, and I just felt that so clearly in you, and that was part of your experience of all of this.
Well, and you and I have talked about this a lot too, but the interesting thing is I have the exact life I had before the podcast.
Yeah.
Same 3 kids, same husband, pretty much same living kind of the circumstances of my life, and I would say I am exponentially more grateful, and I'm sure 5 years ago, I had a gratitude journal and was,
Right.
trying to be a
Right.
thankful, grateful person.
Yes.
I think it's about building a life as much as you can that is aligned with your values. Like, I always remember our pastor, we used to go to a church here in Brentwood. one day did a sermon and he was asking people to reflect on, what matters most? What do you care about most? What are your values? And everybody's sort of reflecting. And then he asked everyone to take out their phones and pull up their calendars
Yeah.
and said, "How are your values lining up?" And not that, obviously there's lots to get done in life, but
Sure.
I think as a result of All the Wiser, I live a life that is more aligned with the things I value most and the people I value most. And so there's just more moments to really be there and present and available to like all of the goodness in those
Yeah.
moments, most of them small, like I said. And that's different than just writing down something you're grateful. I think it's really like feeling it or
Yes.
experiencing it because you're aware and you're available.
Yes. And living into the heart of it,
Yeah.
not just the strategy in the head of it. And that's been my experience practicing gratitude. As you know, you've done it with me every December. I've done it, but I make this big push for gratitude, 31 days of gratitude in December, because it's such a busy, consumer oriented month. If you're celebrating Christmas and gift giving or Hanukkah or whatever you're doing, and family gatherings and time off with your kids, and also the end of the year. So it's like all of this in one packed 31 days. And the reason I get so committed to gratitude is because it makes me appreciate all of it in a deeper way when I move to that heart centered, like, oh, I'm really experiencing this with all my senses. I'm not just
Yeah.
doing it from up here
Yeah.
like I should be doing it. And that's certainly, I think, listening to All the Wiser and being side by side and, walking alongside you as you launched it. And then through the experience of it, it was so much about you being present and just feeling how people's stories can impact each other and impact a community of listeners. It's really,
Yeah.
sometimes I think it's all we have is each
Yeah.
other's stories. That's all we have. And that's all that really matters at the end. When you go back to BJ Miller and death awareness, back to BJ Miller's work, which blew my mind years ago when I discovered not just his work, but I should do a shout out to all of end of life care. And it's become such a huge field. You and I have talked about that so much. And so many of your guests on All the Wiser face their mortality.
Yeah.
And so to
Yeah.
remember that we are here, we are passing through, we're not here forever. And that's actually what makes us wiser, is that the reality of the perspective of, gosh, I have this moment. The past doesn't really matter right now. And the
Yeah.
future, I don't know the future. This is really all I have. And that was the biggest thing I felt like in you that I could feel, just as settling.
It's, these I don't know, maybe you and I, because we love talking about these things and hearing other people talk about these things, but I almost wish there was like a sneaky way into like a new word we could brand for gratitude because it's been talked about so
Yeah,
much that I sometimes feel like, even with my kids, I'm like, everyone's like, oh, yeah,
totally.
gratitude, gratitude. Like, yeah, like I've seen a, whatever, like, yeah, that was embroidered on someone's pillow
Yeah.
or I saw it at my school sign. Like, it's everywhere, right? But it is a magic pill elixir type situation when you fully lean into it.
Yeah.
Because to go back to where we started with sort of that longing or that sort of emptiness,
Yeah.
restlessness, to just like fully be in the moment and see how beautiful and true and right it
Yeah.
is when those moments are available to you. I think it brings a lot of happiness and peace.
Yeah. And I think back to that part of setting something free. What I learned from All the Wiser is that it doesn't matter if the moment is the perfect moment. These
Yeah.
people were finding peace and gratitude and hope in moments that were so difficult, so painful, so surprising. And I think that we, in our minds, it's like it has to go this way. If it goes this way, then I'll feel this.
Hmm.
And the gratitude is situated around, if I have this, then I'll feel grateful. Or
Yeah.
when I get this, I'll feel grateful. And that project and just all those people, all those stories that you have, which are still available, they're evergreen. And we will certainly, take our listeners, whoever's listening to us now, and invite them to go there because it's so inspiring to hear how they found gratitude
Hmm.
and hope and faith and love in a very unexpected moment, and that we can all do that. We can
Yeah.
all take a very mundane moment and find it, and you can take an extraordinarily difficult moment and find it. It's like the person who calls or the neighbor who comes by or the interaction with the stranger, and you're like, "Wow, that's exactly what I needed today, and today's been a really difficult day."
Yeah. And I think we're also disconnected, right? With
Mhm.
like everything from like we do a lot less in person, or it's a
Yes.
quick text here, or you're waiting in line but everyone's on your phone, or you don't walk into the place because they can drop it at your door. And I think all the wiser allowed me to deeply connect with 100 people,
Yeah.
and even saying it out loud, like, can never take that for granted, especially, some of it was during the pandemic, and I really went inward for a while during, as you know. Yeah, it kind of felt like 5 years of going to, like, I don't know, getting a degree in wisdom and having, like, live therapy and broadcasting it to everyone I know.
Yeah. And opening your heart.
And opening my heart. Now, one of my favorite things to look forward to in December is your gratitude newsletter or writings.
Yes.
And I think, was it last year? We took a trip to
Yes,
Southeast
I
Asia.
remember this, and you were
And I
still
was, like,
doing
in
it. Yes.
Singapore, and, I mean, all over it was incredible. I was, like, in Thailand reading about, like,
Yeah.
Paige in the backyard and the dog and the fence that opens up, and, like,
Yeah.
and last year I gifted it to my mom, so I love that it's timed with that because it's really been meaningful to me.
I'm so glad. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for sharing and sharing your story and being in my life, and 31 days of gratitude is really infinite gratitude. It's
Yeah,
every
so
day.
yeah.
So, I appreciate that, learning that with you and sharing that with you.
Well, I could not be more grateful for our professional relationship and everything you've helped me with, but certainly our friendship and our personal relationship as well, so,
Likewise.
okay.
Thanks, Kimmy.